Now, we come to the famous crisis plan that you'll read about within all the texts, and what should be in a typical organisational crisis plan. Well, often you find, first of all, that there's a risk audit done of the various types of crises that occur. Then the strategy for operational handling of risks and threats and crises should be coordinated with the communication strategy. Very, very important indeed that the two are integrated. Then with this sort of crisis plan, there should be simulations. Now, within Northern Ireland in recent years, that has been done within our major transport organisations and hospitals, security forces and emergency services, and done very well and very effectively. But apart from the crisis plan, you often find these crisis plans can be extraordinarily lengthy and detailed, and that has to be for insurance purposes and good practice. But I always recommend that beside that there is a shorter crisis document, which is a list of key things that have to be done by a manager when crisis occurs. And the reason for that is that often when particular crises happen, that managers are literally frozen on the spot, as one would expect. You know, this is not a daily event. And therefore it's always good to have a crisis list of, you know, stop, think, what has happened, basic questions, what do you next, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. And that helps managers to get going and to get on to issue, to manage what has actually happened. Very, very important. Then there's the debate about crisis team and who should be on a crisis team. And in particular, should the chief executive be on the crisis team? Well, it depends on the time and the ability of the chief executive. But the answer to that is generally yes. Obviously, he or she brings that experience of the whole organisation. Crucially, however, is that the crisis team, and this, you know, it is the most important issue, should have the trust of the chief executive at a minimum. Then the question, should the chief executive be the spokesperson? Well, the answer to that is, again, it depends on the ability of the chief executive to speak with clarity and conviction in a crisis. And generally the answer would be, I think, from my own personal perspective, the answer would be yes. It is good to see the chief executive coming forward and speaking. But as well as the chief executive, there needs to be other spokespersons as well in many crisis situations, and all the spokespersons, while speaking about different issues, obviously speak on message and with one voice. So you have the specialist relating to, let's say, the corporation, sometimes the company, and sometimes technical specialists dealing of how organisations are managing crises. But it is important to reflect on the crisis team. Now, are there any other key points about the management of crises that are important? I think yes. Seymour and Moore talk about communication in crisis, and they talk about the 5 C's, and that is when people are talking to camera and talking to people and publics who have been impacted by the crisis. There are words that I think are important. So when you're talking and when you're writing, things like care, commitment, consistency, coherence and clarity are very, very important. But we're kind of suggesting, and this is often I ask students to stop and think a little bit when they look back at various crisis examples. Because some texts say things like, when a crisis happens, tell it all, tell it quickly. And I'm not so sure whether that is good advice for young people starting to study crisis management. Think about this. When an incident happens, it could be an issue, it could be a crisis. Stop, take time, think, and ask yourself, is it a crisis? Is there a problem here? And is this our problem? Think, because it might not be. And it might be to do with rumour, it might be to do with something that actually is factually incorrect, and it needs to be corrected. In that sense, proactivity and managing issues like that are very, very important. So if we were to study and then reflect on managing crises, what would be the headings? Firstly, I think, as Francis Carty and many others have talked about, is to react immediately. So, very important. Look at the issue, look at the crisis, reflect on it. If it is a crisis, react immediately. Get the team together, centralise it, get control. Secondly, take charge, assess the situation, ask the questions, go into more detail, care for those affected, brief staff, prepare statements to the press, all those things very important. Next, gradually release the information, in particular maybe list certain publics that information needs to be given to, and then manage the information flow, very importantly. Manage your spokespersons, get them to stay on message, use the right spokespersons at the right time, recognise the importance of the press conference when it needs to be called, when the media need specific types of information, very important. And a key word throughout the management of crises is to monitor the situation. So what other additional information needs to be given, when does it need to be given, who do we need to be speaking to, what do we need to do? All those things, very, very important indeed. And then, of course, to recognise, very, very importantly, that when crisis happens, there is an aftermath. And a lot of work has been done on this. Murphy, for example, writes about the unexpected light. In other words, the positive aspects. Ramey has written a lot about the opportunities that emerge from crises. And in fact, what often happens is that people are much more prepared to prepare for crises when something has happened in the and to look to the future and be better prepared. And very importantly, and this is what we've learned a great deal from 30 Years of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, when a crisis does occur, especially over a prolonged period, it doesn't just end there. You know, quite often crisis results in loss of life. As a result of that, for years and years afterwards, individuals have to be counselled to try and deal with the trauma and the aftermath of crisis. And PR people, managers, have to recognise that fact. You know, you don't just close the door when a crisis incident has happened. People have a responsibility in the aftermath of crisis. Now, what is important now for young PR practitioners and for students? Well, I think what you have to do is go and read the detailed notes that I'll provide for you on issues related to risk, issue management and crisis management. And above all, look at the various case studies that are available within the textbooks and with my own notes. Then you'll be able to become better prepared for the seminars that will follow.